Luis Martins presenting his securing Pentaho deployment.
Yeah, thank you, Jens. I hope you all had good lunch, plenty of coffee. This is going to be tough. So let's go, let's talk about security in 20 minutes. So we could spend an entire day talking about security, an entire week. Let's do it in 20 minutes. So it's going to be fast. Let's talk about some basic stuff first. Basics. It may seem very obvious, but sometimes it's the obvious things that the hackers look for. So never forget a few things. To remove all sample users, all the passwords are just passwords, and the code is open source, so anyone can easily find what passwords to try to look for and what users could be there already. So remove those or change the passwords. Set a secure password for the admin user and remove that dialog thing there that helps while you are developing, but don't leave it there when you go into production. This, again, this may seem really basic, really obvious, sometimes it isn't. More, there are 3 users for 3 different platform databases. The passwords again, can anyone guess what they are? Password, yeah, so change those. Hackers will look for that. You will have to look in several configuration files where to change the passwords. They are scattered across multiple files, so you may think, oh, I found the place where to change the password. Usually there is more places where you have to change the password, so look out for that, because some services may not run and others may, so you may have a faulty deployment. Speaking of passwords, and still speaking of passwords, password encryption. This one is one of the things that can bite you later on. By default, Kettle has an encryption algorithm that I would prefer to call an obfuscation algorithm. It's really, really basic. It just takes your password, takes a number and multiplies the password by that number. It's a 40-digit number. But the original key is embedded in the source code. It's not generated.
It was called encryption to de-incentivize people to work. I mean,
Yeah. Thank you, Matt. It's available both in CE and EE versions, and like I was saying, the seed is embedded in the code. It's not generated for each individual installation, so you need to set a new Kettle property with a new key. That's the name of the key, the name of the key value, and it's just a 40-digit number, a random number, and you will be good to go. But like I said, it's not very secure. The next big thing, it's in the Enterprise Edition version. It uses AES, sorry, so many acronyms. It uses AES, it's much more secure, but unfortunately only for enterprise customers. But don't worry, it's very, very easy to roll your own encryption plugin with any algorithm that you want to use. I tried that, I rolled my own. It's available on GitHub, you can just compile it. It's not available on the marketplace yet. You will have to build it and deploy it, but it's still very simple. If you have any doubts, come and ask me later how you can roll your own. Where do you use these passwords? You use it on any transformation, any job, any database connection that you define. They will store the passwords as you type them, so better type them encrypted, otherwise they will be visible. When you export a transformation, when you send that transformation to someone, your password goes in there. So better be encrypted, otherwise you will be sharing your password with the world, possibly. You can use encrypted passwords in the JNDI configuration as well. Unfortunately, you can't use encrypted passwords in those 3 database users that I mentioned earlier, because those, it's They are used by Jackrabbit, by Spring Security, and a few other frameworks, and those frameworks can't access our encryption algorithm. So it's unfortunate. Another thing that you should also be aware is that when you use command line utilities, those can have your password to do some operations. Always use the encrypted version as well. You may think, well, I'm just the one around this screen, I'm just the one, no one is looking over my shoulder, so no one will see my password. Anyone logged on the server will. Just use the process status command and there you have it. Your password open to anyone, so never type your password on the command line utilities. Next thing, some people neglect to use SSL. How many of you have deployed a Pentaho server and set up HTTPS? Yeah? No, not that many. It's not so hard, guys, come on. You can use either a self-signed certificate or you can buy your own. In a production environment, sure, you will have to buy your a certificate so that it's recognized by anyone. It's fairly easy to install once you know how to. I will provide some links to some resources that tell you exactly step by step how you can do it. The risk is, of course, again, people can see your password when you are logging in. This is just using developer tools on the browser, but anyone sniffing the network will be able to capture a password very, very easily. So again, don't forget to use HTTPS. Unless, of course, you use some other means to log on to Pentaho server. I will talk about that in the next section. You can use 3 different authentication mechanisms. If anyone wants to understand better what is the difference between authentication and authorization, you can come and talk to me later. It will take a while to explain. But in Pentaho server, you can use 3 different mechanisms. You can use the out-of-the-box forms-based authentication that uses Jackrabbit as the repository. So Jackrabbit will handle all users, all passwords, all groups, all roles. It's fine for a small deployment, but if you start growing in a number of users, you will find that it gets hard to manage, and it's better to leverage, for instance, Active Directory that you may have in your organization or your customers may have. Lots of companies will have. If not, leverage some other LDAP system that you can use to manage all your users. And usually the good thing is that all the users will already be created in that system because they are probably used by some other application. So you don't have to replicate all the work, creating new users in Pentaho server, then managing all the passwords, then after the holidays, half of your users will forget the passwords. And yeah, it's a pain, yeah. You can also, if you use Active Directory or any other LDAP system, in the Community Edition, you will have to configure it manually in a text file. I will have a link for that in the resources slide. If you have the Enterprise Edition, there is a fancy UI that will let you type in all the details. There, sit in the front row. I was saving that one for you. Like I was saying, there's a fancy UI, but it's fairly simple to configure in the Community Edition. There's also the option, and it's one of my favorites, to completely delegate the authentication from Pentaho server into other systems. For instance, you can use SAML authentication. Think of Live ID, Google, whatever, Facebook, Twitter. All these companies have an identity provider in place. All your potential users will probably have an account in that system, so you can just forget about managing users and have someone else handle the authentication and use federated authentication. It's more complex to set up. There are some samples in GitHub on the under the Pentaho organization, some SAML samples. I will provide also a link for that, so you guys can set up your SAML authentication. Next, why am I talking about disaster recovery and something about security? Anyone? Yeah, sure, why not? No, it's an area of security. Many people think, well, disaster recovery is something that should be handled by infrastructure. No, it's an area of security. And if you want to keep your servers running, you have to have a disaster recovery plan in place. Otherwise, when something happens, you have nowhere to run your servers. So have a recovery plan in place, define your RTOs and your RPOs well. Usually, anyone knows what RPOs and RTOs mean? The time, RTO, it's the time it will take you to get online again. The RPOs, it's the amount of data that you are willing to lose. For instance, if you have a daily backup, you may lose as much as a day's worth of data. If you have an hourly backup, you know the answer. But that will take more storage. That may mean that you need more hardware. So there's always a triangle between the RTO, the RPO, and the money you spend in your disaster recovery plan. But before you go into backups and restores and all that, how many of you know that you can activate versioning in the Pentaho server repository? Yeah? Only 3, 4? Okay.
It's not true, right?
Sorry?
It's not version added, it's revision.
Okay. It's what you like to call it.
No, that's what everybody likes to call versioning of data sets and revisions of files.
So, yeah, like Matt is saying, it's not versions of data sets, it's the versions of your files, your transformations. But it's a way of recovering from a disaster. A disaster can be something as simple as, oops, I wrote a file on top of that one and I lost my transformation. Now what? Do I need to go to the backup and find my transformation? No. If you have revisioned, you can just simply restore it. The other simple disaster is, oops, I deleted a file. There is the recycle bin, so you can easily recover the file. I don't know what is the retention policy of the recycle bin. I tried to find, and I couldn't. I would guess the files will never get deleted, but I wouldn't trust on that. So have your backups in place, but yeah. Speaking of backups, there are 2, possibly 3 ways to back up your Pentaho server, maybe more. I say possibly 3 because just before yesterday someone mentioned to me Pentaho Repository Synchronizer, something that was developed for Pentaho 5.0. I don't know if it still works. I didn't find a new version of it for 8x. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. It's not that important. You have 2 other possibilities. The import-export script that will just export your repository to whatever file system you want and then think about saving that in a tape or whatever. My preferred method would be to use an actual database backup system. Usually those will roll the backups weekly or monthly. They will store them in tapes. So it's a better strategy to have a proper backup system in place. Also important, don't forget to back up your configuration files. You may think, well, I have backup of my repository, I can get the binaries for the server from Pentaho, from Hitachi. What about the configuration files? Don't forget those. And even more important, and I've seen that happen to some clients, to some customers, when I was a consultant. They backed up everything and they forgot to back up the custom plugins that they developed. And when the disaster happened, they didn't have the source code for the custom plugins and they didn't have the custom plugins. So always back up everything that you do on top of Pentaho server or Kettle that you get from us. Okay? So that's all I had to say about security. And now you can ask me some questions. We have about between 4 and 5 minutes. I was on schedule. So, anyone?
Just comment on that Pentaho synchronizer, repository synchronizer, and
Yes.
the ways to back up. We use the database synchronization on PostgreSQL to create second database and update it every real time. So we have backup server on.
Yeah. Like I mentioned, use something on the database level, and you are good to go. Yeah.
Good. Any other questions?
Yeah.
The import-export command, the import-export.sh, okay, makes a copy just of the database or everything?
Of the repository contents.
Just the Jackrabbit repository?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So no configuration, no
configuration.
plugin, no nothing.
That's why I added that.
Perfect.
Yeah. Just your files inside the repository.
Another question is, when you talk about SSO, you're talking about authentication, I think.
Yes.
Yes, okay. But in that case, how do you manage the authorization?
You still, okay.
For example,
Good question.
modern profiles, something like that.
Good question. It's a hybrid thing. You will manage your authentication somewhere else, and then inside Pentaho server you still have to manage the roles. Okay.
Good. Any other question? Okay, so thanks, Luis. Thanks.
Thank you.